Some of the most talented Hollywood stars didn't just have talent, they were also gorgeous and charming too. What you don't know is that some of them had horrible personal hygiene that made them a pain to work with. From sweaty feet to skipping bath time, some of these hygiene practices would leave you in shock. Elmo Lincoln's dirtiness. He swung onto the scene back in 1918 with Tarzan of the Apes, and while he looked rugged and wild apparently, it wasn't all just for the role. People on set had plenty to say about his personal hygiene, or lack thereof. Elmo had a reputation for skipping out on the basics, like bathing regularly or keeping his hair in check. Considering his role involved wearing little more than a loincloth and swinging around the jungle, you'd think staying fresh might have been a priority. But no, the guy was often described as unkempt, and the sweaty, dirty look wasn't always movie magic. Crew members would complain about having to deal with him up close, especially during long shoots under the hot lights. And with Hollywood still figuring out soundstage ventilation and makeup tricks back then, let's just say his on-set aroma probably didn't help morale. Elmo's Tarzan might have been a hit with audiences, but behind the scenes his grooming, or lack thereof, wasn't winning him any fans among his co-workers. It's a little ironic. He played a man raised by apes, but apparently he didn't mind taking some of that jungle lifestyle home with him. Mabel Normand's lack of self-care. Funny, talented, and unapologetically herself, Mabel didn't just act. She was also a writer, producer, and director, breaking ground in an industry dominated by men. But as much as people admired her comedic genius, she was also the subject of gossip, and her hygiene habits, or lack of them, were often a topic of conversation. For starters, Mabel wasn't the type to obsess over appearances like many of her contemporaries. In an era where stars were expected to exude glamour and perfection, Mabel's bohemian lifestyle set her apart. She was known to show up to set looking a bit disheveled, with hair that hadn't been brushed and clothing that hadn't seen the laundry in a while. Costumers and makeup artists reportedly had to work overtime to transform her into the polished image fans saw on screen. Then there were the stories about her personal belongings. Mabel was notorious for carrying around a cluttered, chaotic handbag that reportedly smelled less than pleasant. It was said to be stuffed with all sorts of random items, from crumpled notes to half-eaten snacks, and it seemed to be more of a mobile trash can than a purse. People who got a glimpse of it would often joke about its state, but Mabel herself didn't seem to care. Her home life was no different. Mabel's house was reportedly a whirlwind of clutter, with piles of clothes and personal items scattered everywhere. Guests described it as messy but oddly charming. Just like Mabel, it wasn't filthy or unsanitary, but it was definitely the opposite of the pristine, meticulously decorated homes that other stars of the time proudly displayed. Part of this may have been due to her demanding lifestyle. Mabel worked long hours, and when she wasn't on set, she was out living life to the fullest. She loved socializing, and she had a wild side that often led to late-night parties and carefree mornings. Hygiene and tidiness probably weren't high on her list of priorities when she was busy juggling her career and her social life. Her habits extended beyond herself to her pets. Mabel loved animals and was known to keep several dogs around, which only added to the chaos of her home. Visitors often noted the strong smell of wet dog lingering in the air, which she seemed to take in stride. Despite all this, Mabel's charm and talent often overshadowed her eccentricities. People loved her for her quick wit, her ability to make others laugh, and her refusal to conform to Hollywood's rigid standards. She was a free spirit who lived life on her own terms, and while her hygiene habits might not have been picture perfect, they were just one part of her colorful personality. Tragically, Mabel's life was cut short at the age of 37 due to tuberculosis, and much of the gossip about her faded into the background of her legacy as a comedic trailblazer. But for those who knew her, her quirks, including her unconventional approach to cleanliness, were part of what made her unforgettable. Errol Flynn's odor. Imagine stepping onto the set of a big Hollywood blockbuster, ready to lock eyes with the most dashing leading man of the era, only to catch a whiff of someone who clearly hasn't seen a bar of soap in days. That's what it was like working with Errol Flynn, the ultimate swashbuckling heartthrob who, let's be honest, was as famous for his charm as he was for skipping the bathtub. Flynn wasn't just a little lax about hygiene, he practically waged a personal crusade against it. Bathing regularly? Not his thing. Rumor has it he could go days, sometimes weeks, without so much as splashing water on himself. To make matters worse, he'd re-wear the same clothes over and over until they were, shall we say, well-seasoned. Fresh laundry wasn't on his radar when there were drinks to be poured, cigars to be smoked, and wild nights to be had. And those wild nights? Oh, they definitely added to the ambiance around him. Between the heavy drinking, chain smoking, and general life-of-the-party antics, Flynn became a walking cocktail of odors that could clear a room, or at least give his co-stars second thoughts about getting too close during a scene. But here's the kicker. Nobody dared to complain. Flynn's charm was so overwhelming that people put up with it. Sure, the love scenes might have required a deep breath of courage, and maybe a shallow one of air, but who could resist the allure of Hollywood's greatest rogue? He was larger than life, and apparently, so was the smell that followed him. Errol Flynn didn't just live by his own rules, he embodied them. Hygiene might have taken a back seat, but for his fans, that devil-may-care attitude was part of the package. If nothing else, Flynn proved you could live unapologetically and still make people swoon, no matter how long it's been since your last bath. But speaking of unpleasant smells, this next star deserves a mention. Ava Gardner and deodorants. Her dazzling smile, perfectly coiffed hair, and magnetic presence make her seem untouchable, otherworldly even. Then, you catch the smell. That's when the myth of Ava Gardner, the sultry screen siren, starts to crumble a little. Because Ava? She didn't exactly believe in deodorant. Oh, Ava was stunning, no doubt about it. She had a natural beauty that made her a favorite of directors and fans alike. But she also had a devil-may-care attitude when it came to personal hygiene. Instead of reaching for deodorant or perfumes, she preferred to go au naturel, embracing whatever came her way, including her body odor. And let's just say it didn't always go unnoticed. Some of her co-stars reportedly found it challenging to keep a straight face during close scenes, but who was going to call her out? She was Ava Gardner, after all, a walking, talking goddess. Part of her nonchalance came from her upbringing. Growing up in rural North Carolina, she didn't have the kind of polished, high-maintenance lifestyle that some Hollywood starlets were used to. She was down-to-earth, unpretentious, and unapologetically herself. Bathing? Sure, when she felt like it. But obsessing over smelling like roses? Not her style. It's almost fitting that someone as wild and free-spirited as Ava would embrace her natural side so fully. She lived her life on her own terms, whether it was her career, her tumultuous love affairs, or her approach to personal care, or lack thereof. And honestly, it only added to her mystique. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was just being Ava. So, if you ever find yourself daydreaming about locking eyes with her on set, just remember, the glamorous stars of Hollywood weren't always as polished up close. Ava Gardner's beauty may have been immortal, but her scent? Well, that was just a little more human. Humphrey Bogart's smelly feet. Imagine being on the set of Casablanca, the cameras rolling, the air thick with tension as Humphrey Bogart delivers one of his legendary lines. His deep voice oozes cool, his tailored suit screams sophistication, and his effortless charm steals the scene. But here's the thing you don't see. Just a few feet away, someone might be holding their breath, trying not to flinch. Why? Because Humphrey Bogart had a dirty little secret. His feet could clear a room. Bogart wasn't big on socks. Sure, today the sockless look is trendy, but back in Hollywood's golden age, it wasn't about fashion. It was about practicality. Or maybe it was sheer indifference. Bogey would slide into his shoes day after day, letting sweat and grime work their magic, marinating the insides until the smell was impossible to ignore. You know that sour, stale smell of well-worn leather shoes that haven't seen fresh air in too long? Multiply that by a Hollywood career's worth of skipped socks and you've got Bogey's signature scent. His co-stars weren't immune to the olfactory assault. During those iconic close-ups, when chemistry had to crackle on screen, it took more than acting chops to keep a straight face. It's said that some cast members avoided standing too close when they could help it, though nobody dared to call him out. He was Humphrey Bogart, after all, the star who could light up the screen even if his feet could practically light up a hazard sign. What's particularly fascinating is how much pride Bogart took in his appearance otherwise. His wardrobe was impeccable. His suits were always tailored to fit like a glove, his ties perfectly knotted, and his trademark trench coat was never less than pristine. He had the aura of a man who had it all together, until you got close enough to realize he'd skipped an essential step: fresh socks. And let's not forget the era he lived in. Back then, the technology for combating odors was, well, limited. Deodorants were basic, and foot powders existed, but let's be honest, Bogey wasn't the type to bother. This was a man who didn't have time for frivolities like foot care. He was too busy perfecting his on-screen persona as the ultimate tough guy. Yet, it's almost poetic in a way. Bogart's disregard for his feet mirrors his larger-than-life persona. He didn't play by the rules, extending from his career choices to his wardrobe. He was unapologetically himself, sweaty feet and all, and somehow that just made him even more magnetic. So the next time you watch him sweep Ingrid Bergman off her feet in Casablanca, just remember, behind every smoldering look and smooth line was a man whose shoes told a very different story. It's a testament to his undeniable charisma that even the most pungent of quirks couldn't tarnish his legacy. Humphrey Bogart remains a legend, not just for his unforgettable performances, but for the very human imperfections that made him so real. Marlene Dietrich and her costumes. Now there's a name that just screams old-school Hollywood glamour. She had it all: the cheekbones, the smoldering voice, the killer wardrobe. But behind all that sparkle was a little secret that wasn't so shiny. Marlene had a serious thing about not washing her costumes. Yep, the same outfits that made her look like a goddess on screen were, in reality, kind of ripe. Here's the deal. Marlene was obsessed with her wardrobe. And honestly, who could blame her? Those costumes were practically works of art. Delicate fabrics, intricate beadwork, sequins catching every light. She wasn't about to let some clunky old cleaning process ruin her masterpieces. But instead of figuring out a solution, she just said, "Nah, I'll skip it." And that's where things got, well, funky. Picture all the hours under blazing studio lights, her costumes soaking up sweat like a sponge. Then she'd wear them again and again. Day after day, the sweat would build up, and no matter how glamorous the outfit looked, it started to carry a not-so-glamorous smell. Perfume can only do so much, you know? Eventually, people started to notice. Co-stars, crew members, anyone standing close enough to breathe the same air. Now, imagine being the actor playing opposite her, leaning in for a big romantic scene. All the elegance and mystique that Dietrich brought to the screen couldn't mask the fact that her gown was working overtime in the scent department. But of course, no one dared to say a word. I mean, this was Marlene Dietrich, the Marlene Dietrich, Hollywood royalty. Complaining about her wasn't exactly a career move. The thing is, it wasn't like she was unhygienic in other ways. This wasn't about laziness or neglect. It was just her being super protective of her image. She thought cleaning her costumes might ruin them, so she stuck to her guns, even if it meant turning the set into her own little sweat-scented bubble. And honestly, it kind of fits her vibe. Marlene was a rule breaker. She wore suits when women were supposed to stick to dresses. She radiated this untouchable, otherworldly coolness. So of course, she wouldn't care about something as mundane as washing her costumes. If anything, it adds to her legend. She was unapologetically herself, perfectly polished, a little rebellious, and, let's be real, a bit stinky. So the next time you watch her light up the screen, just remember, somewhere under all that glamour was a gown that probably needed a serious time out in the laundry. It's oddly comforting though, right? Even Marlene Dietrich had her messy moments. Elizabeth Taylor's oral hygiene. Here's the tea. Behind that stunning exterior, Liz had a little habit that didn't sit well with some of her co-stars. Let's just say her oral hygiene wasn't exactly up to par, and it sometimes made working up close with her a bit of a challenge. Now don't get me wrong, Elizabeth was a full-on goddess, a symbol of glamour and allure, but even goddesses are human, and in Liz's case, the human part came with some questionable choices about her teeth. Apparently, she wasn't the biggest fan of brushing regularly, and her breath, well, let's just say it didn't always match her outer beauty. Imagine this. You're on set, gearing up for a big romantic scene with Elizabeth Taylor herself. You're all in, ready to lose yourself in those mesmerizing eyes. Then she leans in, and bam, it hits you. A less than pleasant waft that makes you wish you could act your way through the scene without actually breathing. Some of her co-stars tried to grin and bear it, but let's be honest. It's hard to focus on delivering your lines when your scene partner's breath is giving off last night's dinner vibes. Rumor has it that certain actors actually complained to the crew about it. Can you imagine being the poor production assistant tasked with subtly delivering mints or suggesting a quick brush-up to one of Hollywood's biggest stars? That takes guts. What makes this even more surprising is how much effort Liz put into the rest of her appearance. She was always dripping in diamonds, her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. You'd think someone so meticulous about her look would be equally invested in keeping things fresh when it came to her teeth. But nope. It's one of those contradictions that makes her even more fascinating. And let's not forget, this was Hollywood in the mid-20th century. Smoking was practically a personality trait back then, and Liz was no stranger to a cigarette or two, or 20. Add that to the mix, and it's no wonder her breath sometimes got the better of her. Honestly, though, who was going to tell Elizabeth freaking Taylor to chew some gum or schedule a dentist appointment? Still, you've got to hand it to her. Bad breath or not, she commanded every room she walked into and captivated audiences like no other. Maybe her confidence was the real secret weapon, overpowering any little flaws along the way. It's just one of those humanizing details that remind us even the most dazzling stars have their quirks. Sure, her breath might not have been minty fresh, but her legacy, that's as unforgettable as it gets. Dudley Nichols' unkempt appearance. Dudley Nichols might not be a household name today, but back in the golden age of Hollywood, he was one of the most respected screenwriters in the business. Known for his sharp wit and ability to craft compelling scripts, Nichols penned classics like The Informer and Stagecoach. But while his work was polished and refined, his personal appearance, not so much. Dudley was a true Hollywood outsider. He didn't care about glitz, glamour, or any of the showbiz fluff that came with his job. While other writers were networking at fancy parties or schmoozing in tailored suits, Nichols was the guy who showed up in the same rumpled clothes, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, and maybe hadn't made it to the shower yet. He had an unkempt look that some colleagues politely called bohemian, and others less charitably described as downright sloppy. His hair often looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days, and he was rarely clean-shaven, sporting a perpetually scruffy face. His clothes were typically wrinkled and mismatched, and it wasn't uncommon for him to re-wear the same outfit multiple days in a row. He clearly valued comfort over style, and while his scripts were immaculate, his wardrobe was the complete opposite. People who worked with him noted that he was all about substance over appearance. He would bury himself in his writing, often in the same cramped, cluttered office space that smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Nichols didn't care if his shirt had a stain on it or if his hair was sticking up. He was too focused on getting the story right, and in a way, his lack of concern for appearances became part of his identity. Dudley also had a bit of a reputation for being a loner. He wasn't the kind of guy to hang out at glamorous Hollywood hotspots. Instead, he preferred quiet spaces where he could think and write, often away from the bustling social scenes. His unpolished look seemed to reflect his rejection of Hollywood's obsession with image. Even at big industry events, Nichols stuck out like a sore thumb. While others showed up in tuxedos and polished shoes, Dudley might wander in wearing a wrinkled suit that didn't quite fit, with ink stains on his fingers from his relentless writing sessions. But instead of trying to blend in, he leaned into it, almost as if he relished being the odd one out. Some people admired him for it. In an industry built on appearances, Dudley Nichols was unapologetically himself. He didn't care what people thought of his disheveled look because he knew his work spoke louder than his clothes ever could. Others, however, found his casual attitude off-putting, especially in a town where appearances were everything. While his unkempt look might have raised eyebrows, Dudley Nichols was a writer who stayed true to himself. He let his scripts do the talking and proved that you didn't need to fit the Hollywood mold to leave an indelible mark on the industry. Sure, he might not have smelled like roses on set, but his stories? Pure gold. Frances Marion's Hygiene. She was a powerhouse of early Hollywood, a screenwriter whose talent and influence shaped some of the biggest films of the silent and early sound eras. She was the mind behind classics like The Champ and The Big House, earning her 2 Academy Awards and cementing her place as one of the most prolific writers of her time. But while Frances was a master at crafting polished stories on paper, her personal habits reportedly didn't always match her professional finesse. It wasn't uncommon for people to comment on her casual approach to personal grooming. Frances was known for being so immersed in her work that things like meticulous cleanliness took a back seat. Those close to her described her as having a creative whirlwind energy, always on the go, bouncing between ideas, and often too preoccupied with her next project to fuss over her appearance. Her outfits were often functional rather than fashionable, and she was known to repeat them without much concern for the Hollywood standard of perfection. She wasn't the type to spend hours getting dolled up. She was more interested in the work itself. This earned her a reputation as someone who valued substance over style, but it also led to whispers about her somewhat lax attitude toward hygiene. Her workspaces were said to reflect this relaxed approach. Frances was a prolific writer, often juggling multiple projects at once, and her desk reportedly looked like an explosion of papers, ink stains, and half-empty coffee cups. People who visited her office described it as chaotic but oddly inspiring, a snapshot of a brilliant mind at work. Frances was also known for her long, grueling writing sessions. She could get so lost in her creative process that she'd go hours, or even days, without taking a break to freshen up. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was more that she didn't prioritize it. For Frances, getting the words right was always more important than keeping up appearances. Despite the occasional whispers, Frances Marion's talent and charisma often overshadowed any criticism of her casual habits. She was a trailblazer in an industry that wasn't exactly welcoming to women at the time, and she broke barriers with her skill and determination. In many ways, her relaxed approach to hygiene mirrored her defiance of Hollywood's rigid expectations. She didn't need to conform to anyone's standards because her work spoke volumes.